They say smell is the sense most tied to memory. For me, it's the feel of earth. Not the dry, dusty stuff of the road, but the rich, dark loam down by the river, the soil my father turned with his hands and his hope. I can close my eyes, my 82-year-old fingers curled around the smooth, worn head of my cane, and feel it. Cool and yielding, teeming with a secret life I never fully appreciated until it was gone. That land wasn't just a plot on a surveyor's map. It was the texture of my life, the ground upon which my history was written. And 30 years ago, a man named Harold Burns scooped it up like it was his due and left me with nothing but the dust of betrayal in my mouth. I remember the day he came. It was a Tuesday. The air was thick with the promise of a late summer storm, and the light had that peculiar greenish gold quality that makes the world feel both magical and ominous. I was out back, trying to coax a few last tomatoes from the vines my wife, Clara, had planted before she passed. The plants were struggling, like most things did after she was gone. My hands were stained with soil, and the ache in my lower back was a familiar, dull companion. I heard the car before I saw it, a new, quiet-engined sedan that purred up our gravel drive, a sound that didn't belong. Out stepped Harold Burns, the mayor. He was a big man, not fat then, but solid, with a politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore a suit that cost more than my truck, and he carried himself with the unshakable certainty of a man who has never been told no. "Afternoon, Eli," he said, using my name with a familiarity he hadn't earned. He looked around, his gaze sweeping over our modest clapboard house, the overgrown garden, the tire swing hanging limp from the old oak. It was an assessing look, the look of a man tallying a sum. "Mayor," I replied, wiping my hands on my trousers. I didn't invite him in. He didn't need an invitation. He launched into his spiel, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "Eli, I'll come right to it. The town has a grand opportunity, a vision for a public park down by the river, a place for families, for children, a real community jewel." He spread his hands, as if unveiling a masterpiece. "And your land, Eli, your few acres, they're the cornerstone of this entire project." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "This land isn't for sale, Harold. It's been in my family for 3 generations. His smile didn't falter. "I understand sentimentality, I truly do, but this is for the greater good, progress. We're prepared to offer you a fair price, not its sentimental value, mind you, but its market value." "Market value?" I echoed, the words tasting bitter. "You can't put a market value on the spot where my father taught me to fish, where my children took their first steps, where my wife—" I trailed off, the memory of Clara's laughter down by the water too sharp, too private to share with this man. Harold's face hardened almost imperceptibly. The friendly politician veneer cracked, revealing the granite beneath. "Eli, let's not be difficult. This project is going to happen. It has the full backing of the town council. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. Eminent domain is a powerful tool for civic improvement." The phrase landed like a physical blow. Eminent domain. The government's right to take private property for public use. I had heard of it, of course. A distant, abstract concept from textbooks. It wasn't something that happened to people like me, on land that was more memory than asset.
"You wouldn't," I said, my voice low. "I would hate to," he said, the smile returning, colder now. "But the town's needs come first. Think it over, Eli. Don't let your stubbornness leave you with nothing." He left then, the purr of his engine fading into the humid afternoon, leaving me standing there with the smell of impending rain and the chilling certainty that my world was about to be ripped out from under me. The months that followed were a masterclass in bureaucratic suffocation. It started small, a permit violation for the shed my grandfather had built, a fine for a non-compliant septic system that had worked perfectly for 40 years. Then came the zoning hearings, the mysterious reappraisals that suddenly deemed our land unsuitable for residential use due to seasonal flood risks, a risk that had never once materialized in a century. My objections were met with patronizing smiles and impenetrable legalese from men in suits who all seemed to answer to Harold. I tried to fight. I went to town meetings, my voice shaking with a rage I could barely contain. I was met with averted gazes. Harold had the police chief in his pocket, the head of the zoning board, the local newspaper editor. People were afraid of him, or they benefited from his patronage. Our little town, I learned, wasn't a community, it was Harold's personal fiefdom.
The final notice came on a crisp autumn day. The paper was thick, official. The town of Oak Haven was seizing the property under its right of eminent domain for the development of a public park. The compensation offered was a pittance, a fraction of what even most conservative appraisal should have been. It was theft, dressed up in a suit and tie. The day the bulldozers came to level the old oak and plow under Clara's flower beds, I stood at the edge of the property, my son, Thomas, holding my arm. He was a young man then, his face a mask of helpless fury. He whispered, "We have to do something, Dad." His voice thick. "We can't," I said, the words ash in my mouth. "We don't have the money for a lawyer who could go up against him. He's got the whole system in his pocket." I watched the blades bite into the earth, tearing up the roots of my life. The sound was a roaring grief in my ears. I felt a part of myself tear loose, a vital anchor chain snapping. Thomas eventually turned away, unable to watch, his shoulders slumped in defeat. But I didn't. I forced myself to watch every second of the destruction. I let the image of those grinding blades, the smell of diesel and shattered sap, burn itself into my soul. That was the day the man I was, the man who believed in fairness, in community, in justice, was buried in that same earth. And something else was born, something harder, colder, and infinitely more patient. Harold, of course, got his park. For about a year, there was some half-hearted landscaping, a few benches that were never sat upon. Then, with a swiftness that surprised no one who was paying attention, the town council, citing budgetary constraints and a better offer from a private investor, voted to sell the land. The investor was Harold's brother-in-law, a slick-haired man from the city who never seemed to do a day of real work in his life. Within another year, the public park was a private marina, a playground for the wealthy, with their gleaming, pointless boats. The betrayal was a physical sickness that settled deep in my bones. I saw Harold around town, his girth expanding along with his arrogance. He'd nod at me, a faint, condescending smirk playing on his lips. He'd won. He'd taken what he wanted, and I, the old farmer, had been powerless to stop him. The phrase he'd tossed at me that last bitter day at the town hall meeting became his mantra, repeated to anyone who dared question him.
You can't fight City Hall, Eli. A man has to know his place. I knew my place, all right. It was in the shadows. It was in the quiet. I didn't have money. I didn't have power. But I had time. And I had a memory that had become a vault. I started collecting. Not trinkets or photographs, but ammunition. Every newspaper article mentioning the marina, every public record of the land transfer, every town council meeting minute where the park project was discussed. I took a camera with a long lens and photographed the marina. The private property, no trespassing signs he'd nailed to my trees. The happy, oblivious faces of the wealthy people enjoying what was mine. And I started to read. The local library became my second home. I began with property law, dense, dry texts that made my head swim. I moved on to state statutes on corruption, malfeasance, and the specific, intricate laws governing eminent domain. I was an old man, my formal education long behind me, but I learned with the furious, focused intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important exam of his life. This was my new crop, and I would tend it with more care than my father ever tended his fields. My son, my friends, they all thought I'd given up. They saw a quiet, defeated old man leaning on his cane, puttering around his shrinking world. They'd offer sympathetic smiles, talk about the weather, carefully avoiding the open wound that was the marina down by the river. They didn't see the cold fire that burned behind my eyes. They didn't understand that the quiet wasn't defeat. It was the silence of a hunter who has all the time in the world. Harold Burns had taken my land, but in doing so, he had given me a purpose, a terrible, patient purpose. And I swore to myself as I watched the river flow past the stolen land that I would wait. I would wait for my turn.
Years are deceptive things. To the young, they stretch out like an endless road. To the old, they telescope, one blurring into the next with a swift, silent finality. For me, those years were not a blur. They were a deliberate, granular accumulation. Each day was a single brick laid in a wall I was building, a wall meant to cage Harold Burns. My life acquired a rhythm, a secret liturgy of vengeance. Mornings were for the news. I read the local paper, the regional one, and when I finally learned how to use the computer Thomas bought me, I scoured state government websites. I wasn't just reading, I was prospecting, sifting through the silt of bureaucracy for a single glittering nugget of legal recourse. Afternoons were for the library. Miss Albright, the head librarian, was a woman whose own spirit had been tempered by quiet years and countless books. She never asked why the old man from the stolen Riverland was suddenly so interested in legal archives and state legislative histories. She simply helped me find what I needed. Her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, held a glimmer of unspoken understanding. We were two quiet souls in a temple of words, and she became my unwitting accomplice. It was on one of these afternoons, the dust motes dancing in a slanted beam of sunlight, that I found it. My hands, now more speckled with age, trembled as they held the printout. It was a brief article buried in the back of the state government bulletin. Senate Bill 1147, the Public Use Integrity Act, had been signed into law. Its purpose was to review, retroactively, eminent domain cases where the seized property was later transferred to a private entity for commercial use. The law created a state-level review board with the power to subpoena records, nullify transfers, and levy crippling fines if corruption was found.
It was a narrow, specific law, aimed at a particular brand of graft that had plagued smaller towns across the state. And it was, I realized with a jolt that made my heart hammer against my brittle ribs, tailor-made for my situation. Harold, insulated by his local power and his own arrogance, would have dismissed it as irrelevant state-level noise. He had no idea this law existed. I did. I folded the paper neatly, the crease sharp and final. The hunt was over. The trap was set. Now I needed someone to spring it with me. I had known Sarah, though that's not her real name, as I must be careful, since she was a girl. She'd grown up down the road, a whip-smart, fierce-eyed kid who dreamed of being a lawyer while stocking shelves at her father's struggling grocery store. I'd taken an interest, nothing grand. I'd paid for a few of her textbooks when things were tight. Told her she had a mind too sharp to be dulled by small-town limitations. I'd been a quiet anchor in the storm of her ambition. She'd gone off to law school, graduated near the top of her class, and now worked at a respected, if not flashy, firm in the state capital. She was sharp, hungry, and most importantly, she remembered Harold Burns and what he'd done to me. I called her that evening, my voice calm despite the tremor in my hand. "Eli," she said, her voice warm with surprise, "is everything all right?" "It will be," I said. "I need to hire a lawyer, and I need one who isn't afraid of City Hall." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a charged silence. Then her voice changed, shedding its professional warmth for a blade-like sharpness. "Tell me everything." I met her in the city a week later. Her office was all clean lines and quiet efficiency, a world away from my dusty, memory-haunted house. She listened, her hands steepled under her chin, as I laid it all out, not with the hot rage of 30 years ago, but with the cold, precise delivery of a general presenting a battle plan. I showed her the binders, my life's work, the initial offer from Harold, the subsequent fines and violations, the minutes from the town council meetings, the records of the swift sale to the brother-in-law, the photographs. I showed her the Public Use Integrity Act.
She spent 2 hours going through it, page by page. Finally, she looked up, her eyes alight with a cold, professional fire. "Eli," she said, her voice low and intense, This is a smoking gun. The paper trail is almost poetic. The retroactive clause in this statute, it's perfect. He never saw it coming." "That was the point," I said simply. "We'll need to file a formal petition with the State Review Board," she said, already tapping notes into her computer. "We'll allege gross misuse of eminent domain, corruption, and private enrichment. We'll name Harold Burns, the members of that town council, his brother-in-law, all of them. This will get ugly, Eli. He'll fight back. He'll threaten. He'll try to drag your name through the mud." I leaned forward, my cane propped between my knees. "Let him. I've been standing in mud for 30 years. A little more won't hurt me." We filed the petition. The effect was like poking a hornet's nest with a very long, very precise stick. Harold's first response was bluster. He held a press conference on the steps of the very town hall he'd told me I couldn't fight. He was older, his jowls heavy, his face a mottled red. He called it a frivolous, politically motivated attack by a bitter, delusional old man. He spat my name like a curse. He said I was trying to destroy the town's progress, to steal a valuable asset from the people. I watched it on the local news, sipping my evening tea. I felt nothing but a cold, clean clarity. Then came the threats. An anonymous letter in my mailbox, crudely written, telling me to drop it or else. A late-night hang-up call. One Sunday, I came out of the grocery store to find a long, deep key scratch along the side of my old battered sedan. I reported it all to Sarah, who in turn reported it to the state police, suggesting it was witness intimidation connected to an ongoing state investigation. The anonymous letters and calls stopped. Harold was learning that his local thuggery had no jurisdiction in the world he was now entering. His next move was to try and settle. He sent an intermediary, a smooth-talking lawyer from a big city firm, who offered me a sum of money that was, admittedly, substantial. A generous gesture from Mayor Burns to put this unfortunate chapter behind everyone, the lawyer said, his smile a sterile, expensive thing. Sarah handled it. "Your client isn't offering a gesture," she said, her voice ice. "He's attempting to preempt a state action that will likely see the property returned and his client facing significant financial penalties and potential criminal charges. Our answer is no." The man's smile vanished. "My client has powerful friends." "So does mine," Sarah replied, looking directly at me. The truth. The State Review Board moved with a speed that clearly unnerved Harold. Subpoenas were issued, town hall records were seized, Harold's brother-in-law was brought in for questioning and, facing the threat of his own legal troubles, began to crack. He admitted in a sworn deposition that the purchase had been a sham, that Harold had provided all the funds and had promised him a cut of the marina's profits. The local newspaper, now under new ownership and no longer in Harold's pocket, smelled blood in the water. They ran a series of exposés, digging up old grievances, interviewing other small business owners who'd been strong-armed by the mayor over the years. The public sentiment, once cowed, began to turn. The man who had seemed untouchable was now looking very, very touchable. I walked through my town and I saw the change in people's eyes. No longer pity, but something new. Curiosity, respect, and a flicker of their own long-suppressed hope. They didn't speak to me about it, not directly, but they held doors open a little longer. Their nods were deeper, more meaningful. I had become a symbol, the stone that was finally starting the avalanche. The final hearing before the review board was set. It wasn't a trial, but it had the same weight. It would be held in the county courthouse, a grand old building of marble and stern-faced portraits. It was the arena Harold had never expected to enter. The night before, I didn't sleep. I sat on my porch, looking out into the darkness, towards the river I couldn't see. I wasn't rehearsing my lines or nursing old hatreds. I was thinking of my father, his back bent over the plow. I was thinking of Clara, her head thrown back in laughter, the sun on her hair. I was thinking of my children, their small, muddy feet on the riverbank. I wasn't going to court for revenge, not really. I was going to reclaim a ghost
I was going to give my grandchildren a piece of their history that had been stolen from them before they were even born. I picked up my cane, its wood smoothed by decades of my grip, and went inside. The hunter's patience was finally at an end. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom, and I would take back what was mine.
The county courthouse smelled of lemon-scented polish, old books, and slow, grinding justice. The hallway was a canyon of marble, our footsteps echoing like the ticks of a giant clock, counting down to Harold's doom. Reporters clustered like starlings, their cameras flashing, their voices a low, eager murmur. I ignored them, my focus on the heavy, paneled door at the end of the hall. Sarah walked beside me, a sleek leather briefcase in one hand, her expression one of serene, unshakable competence. She was in her element. I was in mine, too, though mine was a quieter, darker country. The hearing room was packed. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls. I saw faces from my town, shopkeepers, farmers, old friends who had stood by silently all those years ago. Their eyes were on me, wide and expectant. I saw the old town council members, their faces pale and pinched, scattered through the crowd like guilty secrets. And I saw Harold. He was seated at a table with his expensive city lawyer. He looked diminished. His suit, still expensive, seemed to hang on him wrong. The arrogance was still there, a stubborn set to his jaw, but it was cracked, revealing the panic beneath. His face was a thundercloud of purple and red. He refused to look at me. The members of the State Review Board filed in, 3 serious-looking individuals, 2 men and a woman, their faces giving nothing away. The proceedings began with a dry recitation of legal formalities. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood, a calm, commanding presence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out the case, not as an emotional plea, but as a geometric proof of corruption. She walked them through the timeline, displaying my documents on a large screen for the entire room to see. The initial public park proposal, the manufactured violations, the coerced seizure, the shockingly low compensation, and then the swift, almost comically obvious transfer to the brother-in-law. She presented the brother-in-law's deposition, reading his damning admissions in a clear, neutral tone. She showed the marina's profit ledgers, tracing the money back to shell accounts linked to Harold. It was a thing of awful beauty, this dismantling of a man's life's work, a life's work of theft. Harold's lawyer objected, blustered, tried to paint me as a bitter old man on a vendetta. But the facts were a wall against which his rhetoric shattered. The review board listened, their faces growing increasingly grim. Then they called Harold to the stand. He swore the oath, his voice a gravelly rumble. Under Sarah's precise, surgical questioning, he unraveled. He tried to bluff, to claim it was all a series of misunderstandings, unfortunate coincidences. He tried to threaten, subtly referencing his friends in high places. But with each evasive answer, Sarah would simply bring up another document, another date, another dollar amount. The paper trail was indeed airtight. It was a prison he had built for himself, brick by corrupt brick. His denials became more desperate, his face growing slick with sweat. The polished politician was gone, replaced by a cornered, frightened man realizing that the rules he had written for everyone else now applied to him. Finally, it was over. The board members conferred in low tones for what felt like an eternity. The room was utterly silent, the air thick enough to choke on. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the head of my cane, my heart a slow, steady drum in my chest.
The chairwoman, a woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, finally spoke. Her voice was crisp and carried through the silent room. The board finds the evidence of malfeasance, corruption, and a gross perversion of the principle of eminent domain to be overwhelming and incontrovertible. The seizure of the property belonging to Mr. Eli is hereby declared illegal and void. The subsequent transfer of said property to the brother-in-law is nullified. Title of the land and all structures upon it is to be immediately restored to Mr. Eli. A collective gasp rippled through the room. It was followed by a surge of excited whispers. The chairwoman wasn't finished. She turned her gaze to Harold, who had shrunk in his seat. Furthermore, given the egregious nature of this case and the clear evidence of a coordinated scheme for private enrichment, this board levies a fine against Harold Burns personally in an amount equal to 3 times the documented profits generated by the marina operation over the last 30 years. This matter is also being referred to the State Attorney General's office for potential criminal prosecution. It was over. Not just the return of the land, but his financial ruin, and the specter of prison now hung over his head. The mightiest man in Oakhaven had been reduced to a bankrupt, disgraced, and potentially indicted criminal. There was no gavel, no dramatic pronouncement. The board members simply stood and filed out. The room erupted into noise. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Harold's lawyer was grabbing his arm, speaking urgently into his ear. Harold just sat there, staring at the polished wood of the table in front of him, his face a slack mask of utter defeat. The red flush of anger had drained away, leaving behind a sickly, ashen gray. He looked every one of his 79 years, and then some.
I stood up slowly, my knees protesting. Sarah placed a steadying hand on my arm, a small, triumphant smile on her face. "It's done, Eli. It's yours again." I nodded. I felt quiet. There was no triumphant roar in my blood, no desire to shout or jeer. The 30-year-old rage had simply evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep peace. I had carried the weight of that stolen land for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight without it. As we moved towards the door, a path cleared through the crowd. And that's when Harold looked up. Our eyes met across the crowded, noisy room. All his power, his bluster, his contempt was gone. In his eyes, I saw only a hollow, bewildered shock. He couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't comprehend how the old man he'd steamrolled 3 decades ago had finally, so utterly destroyed him. He stood up shakily and was shepherded by his lawyer towards the same door. We converged at the exit, a brief, unavoidable proximity in the press of bodies. He stopped, his eyes locked on mine. He seemed to be searching for something to say, some final scrap of dignity. He found none. I didn't yell. I didn't celebrate. I just leaned on my cane, the wood smooth and familiar in my hand, and I said to him,
my voice calm and clear in the sudden hush that had fallen around us. "Turns out, Harold, City Hall can lose." A spasm crossed his face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just looked away, broken, and was led from the courtroom.
The marina was dismantled. The docks were pulled from the water, the clubhouse torn down. It wasn't a joyful destruction, but a necessary cleansing, like lancing a wound. The town council, now comprised of new, chastened faces, offered a settlement. It was a substantial sum representing the estimated value of the land, plus a significant percentage of the marina's ill-gotten profits. It was more than enough to ensure my comfort for the rest of my days and leave a legacy for my grandchildren. But the money was never the point. The best part was watching the land breathe again. With a portion of the settlement, I hired a crew. We didn't build anything fancy. We planted grass where the asphalt parking lot had been. We put in walking paths that followed the natural contours of the land, not some developer's rigid grid. We built a simple wooden pier for fishing, and we placed benches facing the river, not dedicated to anyone, just benches for tired souls to rest on. We planted young oak saplings to replace the one that had been bulldozed. My grandchildren, Thomas's boys, come to visit me now. Their favorite thing is to go down to the riverbank. I watch them from one of those benches, my cane propped beside me. They skip stones across the water, their laughter ringing out, pure and untroubled, the same sound my own children made, the same sound Clara made. They dig in the same rich, dark earth I did as a boy. Sometimes one of them will bring me a particularly interesting stone or a feather, their small hands grubby with soil. I take it and I feel the texture of the earth on their skin. It is the same earth. It has always been the same earth. Harold Burns couldn't steal that.
He could only borrow it for a while. I am an old man. My body is a collection of aches and reminders. But when I sit on that bench and watch the river flow, watch my grandchildren play on the land that is theirs again, I feel a sense of wholeness I thought was lost forever. The town has a real park now. People use it. Families have picnics. Old men fish from the pier. It is, ironically, everything Harold had falsely promised it would be. I saw him once, about a year after the hearing, in the town grocery store. He was pushing a cart, a much older, shrunken version of the man who had once swaggered through these same aisles. He was alone. He saw me, and for a second the old hatred flashed in his eyes, but it died just as quickly, replaced by a weary acknowledgement. We didn't speak. We just passed each other, two old men in the twilight of our lives, one carrying the weight of what he'd built, the other carrying the peace of what he'd reclaimed. Sometimes revenge doesn't come fast. It doesn't arrive in a blaze of fury, but in the quiet, patient turning of the seasons. It's a seed planted in injustice, tended for decades with memory and resolve, until it finally breaks through the soil into the sun. And when it does, it's worth every second of the wait. What's the most profound or unexpected consequence of patience you've ever witnessed or experienced?